You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
This is Jay from Jay's Analysis. Listen, I want to tell you about today's sponsor for the show, MichiganMushrooms.net. Did you know that mushrooms actually can serve as a substitute for coffee or tea? Yes. In fact, if you are tired of too much caffeine, if it's getting you down, there's actual studies that show that mushrooms have the ability to be a great substitute for coffee and tea. In fact, Solzhenitsyn actually wrote a book about the medicinal facts of the chaga mushroom. So if you go check out MichiganMushrooms.net, you'll see that they offer all kinds of chaga mushrooms, different products to suit your needs. And they've been around as a husband and wife team for the past few years and have really been doing well. So I want to recommend them as a sponsor of this show and thank you for their support. Welcome back. This is Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. We're working through the book of Plato. So you're listening to my podcast, the first half of which will be free to the public. And if you're interested, if you like what you hear, you can subscribe at jaysanalysis.com for the archives and the full talks. And I'm slowly building up quite an arcana, an archive, a lore of lectures and talks. We're going to be talking about Book 4 today of the Republic, where Plato discusses the tripartite division of not just the soul and the human person, but also the Republic as a society, as a Kallipolis, as we saw in the Greek. There's a lot to dig into here, so we're going to be referencing some points that we saw earlier in the book, where Plato discussed the just man, and what happens to the just man in an unjust society. We're going to talk about the religious view of the Delphic Oracle and its place in the Republic. We're going to talk about the relationship of the individual to the many, the one and the many again. And we're going to talk about breeding and the Greek conception of eugenics, eugenos, that would be formative for the rest of Western society as we look at the imperial policies from the Roman Empire and into the British Empire, how they viewed the need for the state to regulate population and breeding. This will be formative and crucial for understanding the 17th, 18th, and 19th century British imperial thinkers, figures like Thomas Malthus, who famously wrote and lectured in his Episcopal cathedral about the dangers of population, and that we would eventually see, he was writing back then, that there would be a population explosion that would then result in mass casualties and death. So is that actually true? Well, we didn't see the population threat explosion that Malthus talked about. And in fact, this was rather an elite social engineering tool that simply continued on. It continued on into Sir Francis Galton and the Huxleys and so forth. Now, I don't want to be imbalanced here, because eugenics is, as I've pointed out many times in many talks, more complex than just this Nazi idea of killing everyone. If we go back to the Greeks and we look here in Book 4, where it begins to be discussed in the Republic, it's really about the notion originally of being well-bred. Now, if you've read Aristotle on politics and on virtues and so forth, Aristotle talks about the need for the good man, the virtuous man, to have been well-bred. And we know that in the modern era, at least as I understand from DNA and genetics, what I've read a good bit on that, tends to speak to the fact that it's something like 60-40. So 60% of who we are and our talents, abilities, skills, susceptibility to diseases and so forth is actually 60% based on hereditary traits, genetics. 40% would be environment and epigenetics and so forth. Our interaction with the environment and how that can affect us positively or negatively in terms of our overall holistic bodily health and in terms of our progeny and what we're going to pass on. So I take the 60-40 view. There's a lot of books on this I could recommend if anyone is interested in that. Going deeper into that subject, maybe in the future we'll get into some more in-depth podcasts on that topic. But right now we need to stay focused on Plato, even though, again, it does have a lot of, in other words, this idea that's in the Greeks, and probably prior to that in most imperial policy back to Babylonians or Egyptians, is that the state needs to control all of this for the purpose of social management and managing the masses. That is kind of the royal art, right? But when it gets to the point of the British Empire, it starts to become a science. And the British imperial writers, again, I've read Galton, I've read his speeches, some of his lectures as well. And when you read it, on the one hand, there's like this half and half. So it's partly, it makes sense, right? I mean, humans are, in one sense, an animal creature. We do have a bodily side that is, in many ways, influenced and determined by our DNA, our genetics. And so there is a sense in which breeding is a choice that the individual makes, and it's natural to us. There's nothing wrong with or contrary to our nature in wanting to choose a fit mate, right? So for the Greeks, in its most simplistic, basic sense, eugenics is that, right? Choosing the best mate, the best possible mate, and that's really a biological drive. I mean, we don't choose intentionally the most unfit, the most unattractive mate, and that's just common sense, right? But what happens is that ideology then gets taken by the state and turned into this tyrannical concept where the state gets the idea that through the scientific process, it can completely control and manage and supposedly create, the Übermensch, the new man, the Oberman, the great man, whatever concepts you want to use. And that can then transcend historical man as man in history, right? And this is where it ultimately gets into transhumanism and things like that. That is the policy of, again, the centralized command and control state wanting to take that over. And that idea is there, that seminal idea is here in Plato, right? I'm not trying to gloss over Plato. It is there. But it really becomes a scientific process in the time of the British Empire with the British imperial thinkers and writers and their treatises on breeding. You can read Galton. Galton has several books on this topic. And they really want this command and control centralized state that, determines who lives or dies. Right? So the downside of this is that when you give the state that power, then it determines euthanasia, right? It's not just a matter of good birth and breeding. It's also a matter of the state determining when you die. And I've referenced many times that's seen in Logan's Run, where in that future dystopia, everyone is just by age, 33, they go to this big ritual and they're all told that they won lottery. Similar idea that we see in a bunch of dystopian fiction. You've won the lottery, so go into the crematorium. Very same idea in Brave New World. Huxley talks about the crematoriums, and you just go in there, and tra la la, it's so happy to die. You've won. You've finished the victory. We're going to cremate you now, and you're going to be fertilizer. And isn't it great that you can go be fertilizer when the state determines at age 30 it's time for you to be fertilizer? Well, so in other words, that's the madness of this, where it spins off into total tyranny. So that's the danger of giving this centralized state the ability and authority to determine life and death, what happens is they run crazy with it. And psychopaths love that. They want more than anything to be in a position where they can torture everyone in 1984, like O'Brien does with Winston, right? So, but we shouldn't let that the danger and fear about that and the state doing that cloud our perception of aspects of this and what it really is, right? So we can approach things in this fear perspective where we think, oh, it's all about this it's all eugenics. Well, kinda, but I mean, in its most basic sense, again, when you choose a good-looking girlfriend and you choose her to mate with, or a girl chooses a good-looking guy who's intelligent, who's creative, whatever, I mean, you're participating in eugenics on a local level, on an individual level, right? And that's really the definition of the term. Okay, so we have to clear away all the baggage around the ideas. Dysgenics is the term in genetics, as I pointed out before, where you have disadvantageous traits that develop in a species. Now, this is something that we observe in nature, right? So there are dysgenic traits that happen at times. But this being weaponized by the state, right? So there's this corollary negative side to the positive side of what eugenics is in terms of its definition. And then when the state takes over in this command and control sense of wanting to be God, play God, the deified state, statism, it then turns around and says, oh, well, we don't want to just determine who lives and dies. We also need to implement this policy on a mass, global level, whatever, where we weaponize genetics, we weaponize the environment, we weaponize the culture, we weaponize medicine, weaponize food, and so forth. And again, it all found in Brave New World. And in this weaponized system, it's spun far out of the original Greek idea. Now, granted, the Greek notion is about state control of breeding, right? So that is in book 4 here of Plato. You don't find dysgenics in Plato. Well, except for, I should clarify that, there is, I think, the notion of infanticide in certain cases. So Plato's Republic does include instances of infanticide, right? Not on necessarily a mass level per se, although obviously the potential for that could be there, right? So Plato's not saying, well, we got to go out and kill all these babies. He's saying that, in his view, there's got to be a regulated population so that it doesn't get out of balance and have too many people in one location or whatever. Now, we do see these kinds of things in the world, unfortunately, where there is areas where it's overpopulated in cities, but we have to keep in mind that the megalopolis, or the megatropolis idea is itself an engineered notion to bring everybody into a state where we're all crowded into these, giant metropolis areas, and where everybody's then miserable and they can't, it's a forced version of slavery. And then you're supposed to, get medicated and, you go through all this process of being miserable, and then you go and die, right? And that's where they want to take us. So in other words, the metropolis idea itself is kind of unnatural in a sense, right? And that's why people, as many others have pointed out, like Chris from Hoaxbusters or Alan Watt, when people that have grown up in the urban area, the metropolis area, they miss out on a lot of the life skills and observances of nature that they would get had they been country boys, good old country boys, instead of being city slickers, right? And so, there's pros and cons either way, but it is an unfortunate situation that the metropolis idea, the idea of the Tower of Babel notion, if you will, that could achieve some sort of utopia, right? And that's ultimately kind of the idea of the city. I'm not trying to oversimplify. I'm just saying that we see these patterns in history, and the nature of the metropolis is such that it kind of in itself breaks down local culture. I'm not a hippie, right? I'm not saying that you have to go live in tents and whatever. Maybe if you want to do that, whatever. But I'm just pointing out different perspectives that we can see in the history of city planning, or the social engineers who did talk about getting everyone corralled into these big metropolis areas to create a situation of the appearance of overpopulation, and then that would give the justification, oh, well then, yeah, we should basically kill all these people because there's just too many people, right? So again, many, many facets to this. You can't oversimplify it and just say something, well, eugenics is evil. Okay, well, so then it's evil that I choose a hot babe to mate with. So I have to go, hook up with some gal who's mentally challenged and, significantly unhealthy and overweight. I mean, I'm not doing that, right? So again, this is natural. This is what we see in nature. Animals choose fit mates as well. They can even sense out through animal instincts unfit mates, right? And if you've spent any time in the company of women, I have, you can notice quite quickly that women are able to sniff out those kinds of disadvantageous traits in males, right? So this is, again, just natural process. We're talking biology here. I'm not confining everything to the biological level. I'm just saying that this is true. These are facts about the level of human biology as we are considered, in part, at least, animals, right? So I believe we have higher faculties, soul, the nous, so forth. We're not just bodies. But when we're talking about that bodily level, this is accurate. This is true. So all the way back to Plato now, that we get a little bit off course, but those things are important because that's why the Republic is relevant for today, right? I mean, the modern state, the modern socialist technocratic state, the Brave New World state, those are all the same, and they're the exact same as the Republic. This is crucial to understand. You can't understand the modern world and the process of communism, Marxism, and socialism without understanding Republic, because they come out of the Republic. Most people don't know this. But the Republic is ultimately a communal superstate. It's Brave New World. It is. And so that's why revolutionaries in history have often been, quote, Republican, which, where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Republic. Plato's Republic, right? The Republic is the ideal state. So knowing then Platonism, what Plato's doing is taking that metaphysics of what he sees as the ideal state as reason, human reason, which is touching on that formal ideal state, and creating the mathematical state. So unfortunately, when we talk about the modern era as the reign of quantity, we have to keep in mind that the reign of quantity, in one sense, it's true that we can, as I've said many times, geometrify nature, right? We can measure anything in terms of line, extension, plane, etc. There is a geometrical level to all of nature. But the problem for the idealist and the rationalist and the imperialist and the technocrat is that for them, that's a totality view of the world. That's a totality view of all things. Everything is quantifiable. Everything is in its place in this rational order. And what it negates or neglects is higher realms, higher truths, higher revelation, the divine, and the soul and the heart, right? The nous. The nous is the faculty that God gave, I believe, where heart and mind and intellect work in tandem to sort of coalesce into this other faculty, the nous. And the nous is what God gave us for knowing Him and the spiritual realm and divine things and seeing things from that perspective. When we dull and dim the nous and shut that realm out, what happens is we no longer see that. We're blinded to that. And then we only see things in this quantifiable technocrat materialist perspective. So that's how we get to the Brave New World state, right? And that's how Plato leads to that, because unfortunately, even though Plato still does believe in those higher realms, because Plato is ultimately a rationalist, this is one of the flaws of Platonism, one of the problems. There's a great piece by Philip Sherrard that is called Logic and the Absolute, which you can find online. I'll try to link that if I remember to. And in Logic and the Absolute, he compares these two positions, between the position of revelation, where we have a revelation of the divine that still contains the realm of the mysterious, or do we have this complete isomorphic identification of the realm of the divine with human logic, right? Or is there an analogy between the two where there's still gray area, right? Where we as humans in our reason never completely encapsulate or completely exemplify or exposit the higher realms or the divine? Or do we completely have an isomorphic human rational analogy to the divine, right? That would be the position of the Platonist or the Neoplatonist, where everything is mathematics, everything is just that, the identification. And ultimately, I believe this is a serious problem for Platonism, and I think Dr. Sherrard teases that out very well in that piece. Because you can see how this would, well, if everything's just completely encapsulated by human reason, then, well, that just leads right back to the Enlightenment. And that's what the Enlightenment thinkers did. And what happens then is that the Enlightenment leads to, a couple of centuries later, you've got the total materialistic, deistic, technocratic state, right? Or the atheistic state. So it just collapses back on itself, because on the one hand, it posits at one point the totality of human reason to grasp everything. When that doesn't happen over a few centuries, it falls back into materialism and nihilism, right? So what begins as a perhaps well-intentioned leftist move towards freedom, reason, the rational state, the republic, then can unfortunately collapse back into the nihilistic state, the power state, the state that is might makes right. Why? Because it's based on this idea that you can construct the ideal state, that you can construct the utopia. And the problem with the idea of thinking that you can construct an ideal state in a utopia is that it doesn't take into account human anthropology. Humans, in general, are not pure rationalists. We're not purely rational beings. We aren't beings that are meant to basically spend all of our time swimming in this sea of algorithms and calculations and pure logic, where we can construct the pure logic state, right? Because not everything in life, not everything about man is pure logic. So it's the taking out of order, right? The taking out of place the proper setting for things like logic or empirical experience or number theory or the ideal realm. It's taking those things out of their correct position, where I believe they should be, for example, submitted to the realm of the divine, right? So they should be subordinate to that, and they have their place, right? Just like the scientific method. The scientific method has its place in man's experience of and understanding of the natural world out there. But the scientific method itself cannot be, by its very nature, elevated into this grand narrative. And that's what happens with rationalism, is that it starts with rationalism. And we see this in the history of the West. It turns into naive empiricism. Naive empiricism might last for a little while, but it's just such a stupid philosophy and so obviously contradictory and nonsensical that it quickly devolves into nihilism. And that's where we are now, the techno-nihilistic state. And that's the state of Brave New World. So that's the danger, the insights, the truth, and the lies that are Book 4 of the Republic. So another interesting point that ties it into Brave New World is the happiness principle. So Plato thinks that the best state is going to be the state that's run where most people are the happiest. And the happiness principle here does not mean McDonald's and Happy Meals. He's talking about, he believes that men are most happy, most contented when they are operating in harmony with what their nature suits them to do. Not everyone's nature suits them to be rulers. Not everyone's nature suits them to be warriors or guardians. Not everyone's nature suits them to be artisans or poets or musicians, etc., etc. And so quite clearly, men have different talents, skills, abilities, and so forth. And so for the Kallipolis, the ideal state, there would be some mechanism by which men would be known to have their certain place in society. And that's Plato's view. So we're not going to have this idea of, wandering about trying to figure out what you're going to do. So whether you agree with this or not, I'm just telling you what Plato's perspective is. You're not going to be, 22 and going to school and trying to figure out what you want to do for your whole life. You will have already known. It will have already been determined what your aptitudes and abilities are quite earlier, right, than college age or graduating college or whatever, high school. We can see inklings of this in the Germanic education system, where this is kind of what they do in Germany. And as I understand, this kind of goes back to the Prussian model of education. In the Prussian education model, which is very dogmatic, doctrinaire, and authoritative and centralized. I mean, it has its pros and its cons as well. I mean, on the one hand, it doesn't make sense for people to be 22 and thinking, oh, I'm going to go be an actor or an actress, right? It's very unrealistic, right? Am I saying that we should construct a society where everybody is determined from age, 4 what they're going to do? No, not necessarily. I mean, there's no simple answers to these things. Okay, so don't be idealistic in the sense of listening to me, thinking that I'm going to be able to give you some simple answer to this. The reality is the world's a big place. There are a lot of different people, different types of people, different tribes of people, and they do things differently. And I think they should have the right to do things differently. I don't think that the absurdity of the West and its imperialism should have this stance of, under the guise of so-called democracy, trying to enforce democratic liberalism on the world. That is itself anti-liberal, as Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin makes such a great point about. So, but again, we see all of the inklings of good and bad in Plato's Republic, right? So there's a lot of good and there's a lot of bad here. And this happiness principle that would come to flourish the time of the British empiricists with people like Bentham and the empiricist thinkers, the utilitarians who thought that they could tease out a moral calculus. Come on, that's completely ridiculous. But the moral calculus could then tell them what was the best decisions for the state to make and for individuals to make in their lives and so forth, trying to build up this ethics of utilitarianism, which is ultimately completely ridiculous because it doesn't tell you, it has no way to tell you which types of actions are most advantageous. So the happiness principle doesn't tell you whether you're supposed to make a certain number of people happy or a qualitative versus quantitative happiness, right? Now you might say, well, obviously it should be more people. What about why, right? Well, what if I get like the most joy out of killing people or something, as opposed to giving everybody ice cream cones, right? So if the government sets up the state-funded ice cream cone program on Fridays and they give ice cream cones out to 1 billion people, and everybody's kind of happy about that for 20 or 30 minutes. Oh, that was good ice cream. It was neat. I like the sprinkles, the state-sponsored sprinkles. But everybody's just kind of like a little happy, right? So on your moral calculus calculator, you tabulate that gives everybody like 5-point happiness, right? But what if me as an individual, I go and kill people and I get like 95% as a psycho happiness from killing people? How do you know between the many and the one, and this weirdo guy? I don't really kill people. I'm just saying as an example, okay? This one guy getting this psycho somewhere, getting all this pleasure out of it, if he's a sadomasochist or whatever, there's nothing in utilitarianism that tells you that you should choose one over the other, right? Now, generally, as humans, when we hear this kind of typical problem for utilitarianism, we want to say that, well, it ought to be the many, right? We got to do what's best for the most people. Why? Says who? Right? No, I'm not saying that that's wrong. Okay, don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying that the absurdity of these British utilitarians in proposing this as a real workable thesis for like how ethics is supposed to happen in the civil society, it's just completely ridiculous. I mean, it's just dumb as all get out, right? Completely removed from reality. And it's all ad hoc. There's no reason to choose one over the other. You don't know why you're supposed to do this or that. I mean, that's all ridiculous. But it's worth pointing out because we still kind of live in this utilitarian ideology where we think that, you know, you go out and ask your average person out there who's just an idiot relativist, and you say, well, you know, how do you think right and wrong should be, you know, delineated in society? Well, whatever's the happiest for most people, man. You know, you hear some stupid thing like that, and that really has absolutely no foundation, especially since most of these people are going to be philosophical, moral relativists, right? Well, if you're a relativist, as 95% of people are, why should anyone choose to make a great number of people happy? In other words, what binds me to that? Says who? You? Well, I don't have to believe what you say. You're a relativist, right? We're all there's nothing absolutely true. That's just what you think. That's just a subjective feeling that you have. My subjective feeling is that, you know, I want to go out and nuke the world, right? And there's no qualitative marker, you know, point where you can say that's wrong, that's right. All you have is dust in the wind, right? You're just spitting out your own subjective opinions. This concludes the free half of my lecture on Book 4 of Plato's Republic. If you like what you hear, go to jaysanalysis.com and subscribe on the PayPal link for $4.95 a month, where you get access to my archives on Plato's talks, as well as a bevy of other interesting interviews on geopolitics, philosophy, theology, conspiracy, you name it. It's all at jaysanalysis.com. Thank you. As well, I should mention, too, check out michiganmushrooms.net, where they have an excellent selection of chaga mushrooms, which will make for a great tea or coffee for you and your babe.